Welcome back to another episode of The Review, hosted here on the Alaska Landmine. I'm your host, Cale Green, and today we're going to talk about Acting Mayor Austin Quinn-Davidson's decision on Wednesday to enact EO16 starting on December 1st, which will create a month-long hunker down order throughout the municipality. We're going to talk about what it is and how it will impact those of us living in Anchorage. Welcome to The Review. Let's just get right into this thing and go over this order. Let me pull this thing up right here and skip to some of the more interesting parts of what they've called the modified hunker down order. Anchorage is on the brink of overwhelming our public health capacity, endangering the lives and well-being of the people of Anchorage. Both true and dramatic. Or as Heather Harris, the municipality's health department director, said during Acting Mayor Austin Quinn-Davidson's press conference yesterday,
as of today, there are 15,100 confirmed cases in the municipality of COVID-19, including 66 deaths. 2,115 of those are new cases reported within the last week. And that's 14% of the total cases since the beginning of the pandemic. Currently, there are 82 confirmed COVID-19 hospitalizations, with 22 beds available out of a possible 78 staffed ICU beds in Anchorage.
She went on to say the municipality has lost the ability to keep up with contact tracing, and the city is asking folks who test positive to take that into their own hand, informing people you've been in contact with about your results. Thankfully, for people like us who like to see things represented visually, Dr. Tom Hennessy, awesome name, by the way, Dr. Hennessy, an infectious disease epidemiologist from the University of Alaska Anchorage, presented a graph showing the rise of individual case counts in the city starting in September. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but I can do math. And when we're looking at these numbers, the rise in case counts, I want to remind everyone to be careful not to conflate these two important and distinct numbers. There are hospitalizations and case counts. Our case counts are soaring right now. Our hospitalizations aren't soaring, but they're high, and hospitalizations tend to lag behind diagnoses by 10 days or so. Given the rise in case counts, the municipality's actions seem primarily intended to stave off an overwhelming surge in hospitalizations. I want everyone to remember one important number so far: 66. According to Heather Harris, that's the total number of people who have died from COVID-19 in Anchorage as of Wednesday. For our understanding as a group, the number statewide during the same time frame had been 115 deaths credited to COVID-19. For reference, in 2017, 79 people died in car accidents. Now, I don't really want to get into which deaths are worse, and I'm not suggesting that the number of COVID deaths is either low or high, but I'm providing those two numbers as a frame of reference. The only way to understand the scale of human death is to compare it to the scale of human death. Austin Quinn-Davidson's announcement of the mandate felt sincere and heartfelt. It was well balanced with statements by economic experts, medical experts, and members of the community. The information we have now about SARS-CoV-2 is significantly more robust than what it had been during the hunker down order put in place by Mayor Ethan Berkowitz. While the positive case numbers are far higher today, I believe the anxiety about COVID-19 was comparable, if not higher, back in March 22nd during Mayor Berkowitz's initial hunker down order in EO03. We knew less about it. Experts were still speculating that the fatality rate would be closer to the 1918 influenza pandemic at 2.5% in comparison to where it is now with COVID at 2% of known and attributed cases. And that number, by the way, is still highly contested. I just divided the number of folks confirmed with those who died. In Alaska specifically, we're at around 0.3 to 0.5 depending on what cutoff date you're utilizing with the same simple division. So yes, COVID is less deadly than many people initially thought, but the numbers just keep going up. One of the main priorities of the government is public safety, and we all get that. The question we're going to ask today isn't whether or not the government has the power and authority to do what they're doing, because they do. Turns out during a pandemic, executives have martial law-like powers when given the go-ahead by legislative bodies, and our assembly had given the acting mayor the power, the authority, and she's got a will to act on it.
Today, I'm issuing a modified hunker down order that will be in effect for the month of December. Since assuming this role, my goal has been to protect public health and avoid unnecessary deaths while implementing as few restrictions as possible. The Anchorage Health Department has been warning me since I started that if things didn't get better soon, some version of a hunker down would likely be necessary. So far, I've done everything I could employ, less restrictive approaches in the hopes that it would bring the situation under control. But case counts have continued to break records, and our public health team lost its ability to keep up. Today, we find ourselves in a situation that nobody wants to be in. There are no easy answers, but we must act, because continuing on this path is the worst of all bad options.
As an aside, there are significantly worse options. I just want to be clear that doing what we're doing isn't like we're South Dakota or having COVID catching parties like kids infected with the chicken pox in some sort of Sweden summer model on steroids. No, acting mayor Austin Quinn-Davidson, I'm just going to say AQD for short because that is a mouthful. Maybe AQD? No, you know what? Let's just do AQD. And she went on to outline the main bullet points of EO 16. Individuals have to limit outings and physical contact with folks outside of their household. Don't gather in indoor groups larger than 6 and outdoor groups more than 10. So whether it's the Egan Center or Frank's house, regardless of the square footage, no more than 6 people can gather. Unless it's a drive-in event where people are in cars. Or daycares. Or weddings or funerals without food. Those are limited to 20. And political expression and worship services where food is not consumed, which are limited to 50% of the building's capacity. But they also must create a COVID mitigation plan. I think you're probably going to have an increase in the amount of events where people are expressing themselves politically. Indoor holiday bazaars and university classes have their own sets of rules too. The hospitality industry is shut down for indoor dining service. Bingo halls, theaters, private clubs, and other recreation and entertainment facilities are just closed. Masks are, of course, still mandated, and everywhere I go around Anchorage, people seem to comply with the mask thing already, except, of course, Laura Reinbold, but that's an entirely different topic. Organized sports, you can practice if you're 10 feet apart, but you can't compete against other teams. Honestly, I don't even know what sports can comply with this kind of rule except like riflery or maybe cross-country skiing. Even tennis players touch the same ball. Gyms are capped at 25% capacity, and group classes need at least 10 feet of distance between participants. Salons are still somehow allowed at 25% capacity, but they can't provide services that allow the mask to come off. Good news for all the people out there who have an upper lip hair fetish. All retail stores are limited to 25% of building capacity. All establishments where people are there for more than 15 minutes have to keep a legible visitor log. They must have been getting some chicken scratch for their contact tracing over at the municipality. Employers must require employees to work from home when their work can be done so from there, and everything in here carries the old fines and penalties, plus a new one. Let's call it the "we're not around this time" clause, where they can impose a mandatory shutdown of businesses, nonprofits, or other entities for up to 2 weeks if the rules are violated. In case that's not totally clear, that's people from the government coming with plywood and boarding up your windows type shit. Which, think what you want to on this stuff, and trust me, if you're like me, I'm sure you do, but with the implementation of this emergency order, AQD is clearly wielding the executive branch in a way that Ethan was unwilling to do. Which brings me to an interesting point. Do you know who AQD is? Did you know she was the acting mayor? I'd be curious to know her name ID before and after this emergency order go into effect. You and I might know who AQD is, but for the people out there who don't, Austin Quinn-Davidson was elected to the West Anchorage Assembly seat during a special election after a vacancy left by Tim Steele in August 2018. She then won during the regular election back in April of 2020, and when Ethan Berkowitz resigned the mayor's office due to the Maria Athens situation? Is that a Greek stage name? Athens? Athens like Athens, Greece? Makes me think it's a Greek stage name. Either way, let's just call it the incident Ethan's fall from Greece. Like fall from grace. But it's Greece. AQD was appointed acting mayor by a vote of the Anchorage Assembly. Well, it was more like whoever is chair is mayor. And Felix Rivera was chair, and apparently the Assembly didn't want him as mayor, so they reorganized with AQD as chair, so she became the mayor, and now Rivera is chair again. And that's how we got ourselves a non-elected mayor. Sure, she was elected to office. The people of West Anchorage elected her to represent West Anchorage. However, it was the assembly members who positioned themselves in such a way to vote her in as acting mayor. She'll almost certainly be in that position through June. This might explain why AQD is willing to take a more forceful stance against businesses that violate COVID restrictions. She didn't face an election to be mayor. She's got no re-election campaign to worry about. She didn't have to build citywide coalitions to win her assembly seat and isn't beholden to them or campaign promises or mayoral campaign numbers of donors. She's really beholden to the people who elected her in West Anchorage, and that's kind of it. Well, maybe actually to the assembly would put her there. Another thing to consider is that this is basically round 2 with major COVID restrictions coming from the city's executives. Back in August, businesses like Kreiner's Diner got a lot of attention for standing up to the machine. And I think the increase in penalties, in the form of being able to close down businesses for 2 weeks if an order is violated, shows an administration that's cut its teeth on the issue before, and it's ready to chomp down if anybody wants to make themselves a martyr. Regardless of what you think about the appropriateness of COVID restrictions themselves, governance of Anchorage is in a really strange situation here. Our acting mayor wasn't elected to be mayor by the residents of the city. She was elected to represent a relatively liberal district in West Anchorage. And she isn't just warming the bench till the next election. She is wielding extremely broad powers over the lives and businesses of Anchorage residents for 7 months, and what likely will be the darkest hour of the pandemic. And for those of you wondering why we aren't having a special election, according to the Assembly, the folks who gave her that power to begin with were too close to the April election. Now, it's true that democracies have rules and systems for appointing acting or interim executives when the elected executive can't govern. Those rules and systems were followed here when Ethan Berkowitz resigned. But if you believe, as I believe, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, the situation we have here should make you just a little uneasy. We have an assembly who appointed one of their own and gave her unprecedented power throughout the municipality into a seat that is typically filled with somebody who is elected. Civics aside, the main thing I want to talk about today, now that the background is out of the way, is the mandate fair with respects to the numbers and the science. What's so fascinating to me is that this emergency order seems to be baked with the idea of intent. You can't meet in indoor groups with people more than 6, and that's what's safe. Unless it's a wedding, because then it's 20. Out of curiosity, is the virus less likely to go to a wedding out of some respect for the sanctity of marriage? COVID fine, holding off while hairdressers do their thing? The virus will be cool to hang back while professors teach their lesson, projecting their voice to the entire classroom. The aerosols they emit must be different. And that's what probably bothers me most about this emergency order. COVID doesn't care about our intentions. If the science is what we're listening to, then the science should apply to all things equally. I'm not comfortable with the government deciding for people which gatherings are worth participating in and which aren't. Some people get their sense of community from going to church. Some people get that from going to a brew pub. Likely you see a difference between those two situations, but does COVID? I think that's part of what ruffled so many feathers during Ethan Berkowitz's Hunker down back in March, and a modified one in August. People felt the government was picking winners and losers, and a lot of people aren't comfortable with that. Restaurants and other businesses that are being forced to completely close their doors are taking the largest portion of the burden here, both publicly and legally. Here's why. How many businesses are going to make sure they're at 25% capacity? Will a small store have their one employee behind the counter try and keep track? Of course not. If small businesses break the law, no one will notice. No one will enforce it. It's not possible unless there's a flagrant disregard of the rules. However, all eyes are on folks like Andy Kreiner, especially in light of what he and other folks like him have said on the topic of another hunker down order before. Here's a screen grab from a conversation. Is Kreiner going to follow through with his claim to defy this new emergency order? Will other businesses band together and join him? Or will the steep fines and threat of closure in the emergency order convince him to follow the rules this time? Right now, it's impossible to know. But rest assured, there's probably a lot of planning behind closed doors right now as businesses decide whether or not they can openly defy AQD's new emergency order. AQD's administration is clearly anticipating resistance. That's why they added the powerful new close your business down rules in the emergency order. I'm curious to see how this will play out. How many businesses refuse or ignore it? Is the threat of police coming to your business and physically shutting it down enough to make the whole city comply? Or will it spark a wave of civil disobedience? Who knows? But right now, most of these folks are being asked to shut down or limit their own businesses without the promise of financial compensation. I don't see this as anything other than a failure of federal, state, and municipal governments. Each level has somebody to blame for why it's not done. At the federal level, the Republicans blame the Democrats and the Democrats blame the Republicans, but rest assured, both are to blame. Compromise goes a long way and we need it done in a short amount of time. At the state level, well, kind of the same thing. They just can't seem to organize enough to get the job done. And at the municipal level, they're blaming all the levels above them, but given their attempt to purchase 4 buildings with the funds through AO 66, I don't see how they were looking out for the best intentions of people in Anchorage, who they're asking to sacrifice the most from. I'll be really interested to see a breakdown of where they spent their money at the end of this thing. Sounds like a fun episode for Future Us. Thank you so much for joining on another episode of The Review. If you want to learn more about how this is going to shake out, I suggest reading an article on Wednesday's Supreme Court decision, Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Andrew M. Cuomo. I don't know how this is going to pan out, clearly. I do know that this is only going to get worse before it gets better. And even the darkest hour only lasts 60 minutes. See you next time.